The mysterious encounter. It was a quiet evening in the bustling city of Vespera, a place where humans and aliens alike roamed the streets. The city was known for its diverse population, with creatures from all over the galaxy making it their home. Bright lights lit up the streets, and the sound of conversation filled the air. But for one alien girl, nothing about the city felt familiar. She stumbled through the crowded streets, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Her feet ached, and she felt the cold air of the evening biting into her skin. She had no idea where she was or how she had gotten there, but one thing was certain: she didn't belong here. Her name was Lyra, and she was far from her home. A distant galaxy, filled with stars that no human had ever seen, was where she came from. She had been part of an ancient and mysterious race, one with the ability to communicate across vast distances and sense things others couldn't. But right now, none of that mattered. She was lost, and all she wanted was to find someone who could help her. She had crash-landed on Earth days ago, and though she had managed to survive, she was struggling. The technology she carried, which was supposed to guide her home, was malfunctioning. Every time she tried to use it, it sent strange signals, only confusing her further. The people around her seemed strange too, so different from the beings she had known back in her galaxy. They looked at her with curiosity, but no one offered to help. As Lyra moved through the streets, she kept her head low, trying to avoid the stares of the humans. She knew that she looked different. Her skin shimmered faintly under the city lights, and her eyes glowed an eerie shade of purple. But more than that, she felt the weight of her situation. The fear of being caught, the fear of being exposed as an alien. It wasn't long before she caught sight of someone who didn't seem to look at her with judgment. He was standing outside a small cafe, a young man in a worn-out jacket, looking up at the night sky. His name was Jake, and he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Jake had lived in Vespera his whole life, and to be honest, he wasn't particularly fond of it. The city was always busy, full of noise and strangers, and sometimes it felt like no one really connected. But as he stood there, lost in thought, something caught his eye. A girl, unlike anyone he had ever seen before, was walking down the street. Her skin seemed to glow, and her eyes were so different from the humans around her. Jake's curiosity got the better of him, and before he even knew it, he found himself walking towards her. She didn't seem to notice him, too focused on navigating through the crowd, but as he got closer, he could tell something wasn't right. The girl was stumbling, and there was a look of desperation in her eyes. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake asked, stepping up beside her. Lyra turned quickly, startled by the sudden voice. She hadn't been expecting anyone to approach her, especially not someone so human. Her first instinct was to pull away, but something about Jake's tone was gentle, reassuring. I don't know where I am," she said softly, her voice trembling. Jake studied her for a moment, sensing her distress. "You look lost," he said. "Do you need help?" Lyra hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should trust him. Humans could be dangerous, especially to someone like her. But she had no choice. The city was too big, too strange, and she was too vulnerable. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." Without saying another word, Jake smiled kindly at her. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." He led her to a nearby cafe where the lights were warm and inviting. Once inside, they found a small booth by the window. As they sat down, Lyra finally allowed herself to relax, though the tension in her shoulders never fully left. Jake seemed harmless enough, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down completely. "So, what's your name?" Jake asked, trying to make small talk to ease the silence. "Lyra," she answered, her voice quiet but steady. I come from far away." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Far away? Like, out of town far?" Lyra shifted uncomfortably. She had no idea how to explain that she wasn't from Earth, that she came from another galaxy entirely. How could she tell him that? Would he believe her? Not from this planet, she said, keeping her answer simple. She could see the confusion on Jake's face, but she wasn't ready to explain everything just yet. Jake leaned back, trying to understand. So, you're not from around here at all? Lyra nodded. No, I'm not from here. Jake was about to ask more, but then something strange happened. As Lyra sat there, she started to fidget with a small device in her hand. It was a glowing metallic object that seemed to hum softly. Jake noticed her unease and realized that whatever it was important to her. What's that? He asked, pointing to the device. Lyra's eyes flickered to the object, and for a moment, she looked worried. She held it tightly in her hands, as if protecting it from the world. It's important, she said cryptically. Just then, the device flashed with a bright light, and an unfamiliar symbol appeared on the screen. Lyra gasped, and for the first time, Jake saw fear in her eyes. She quickly stuffed the device into her bag, her hands trembling. What was that? Jake asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. I have to go, Lyra said urgently, standing up. It's not safe here. You need to leave too. Before Jake could ask any more questions, she hurried toward the door, her pace quickening, as if something was chasing her. Jake didn't know what was going on, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. Something bigger than either of them could understand was about to unfold. And as Lyra disappeared into the night, Jake knew that he would never be the same. The human guide's curiosity. Jake sat at the cafe for a few moments, his mind racing. He had just met an alien girl, or at least someone who seemed to be from another planet, and she had left him with more questions than answers. He stared at the door she had exited through, wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. Her glowing eyes, the strange device she carried. None of it seemed possible in his world. But then again, how many people in Vespera could claim to have seen something truly extraordinary? Without thinking, Jake stood up and left the cafe, his curiosity pushing him forward. The street was colder now, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and the air had a crisp bite to it. He walked slowly at first, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. He tried to shake the thought of Lyra from his mind, but it was impossible. There was something about her, something in the way she had spoken, the urgency in her eyes, that made him feel like he had just glimpsed a side of the universe that was beyond his comprehension. As Jake rounded a corner, he saw her again, standing in the shadows of an alleyway. Her back was to him, but even from this distance, Jake could tell she was uneasy. Lyra looked like she was scanning the street, her head moving in quick, jerky motions. She was checking for something, or someone. Jake's heart raced as he approached her quietly, not wanting to startle her this time. Lyra? He called out softly, just loud enough for her to hear. She turned swiftly, her eyes locking onto his, but instead of surprise, Jake saw a flicker of fear. The moment her gaze met his, she stiffened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tense. Barely a whisper, there was a hint of panic in her words, as if she hadn't expected him to follow her. "I was worried about you," Jake said, taking a step closer. You left so suddenly. I didn't know if you were okay." Lyra hesitated, her eyes flicking to the device she had hidden in her bag. Jake noticed that her hand was resting on it protectively, as though it was something precious, something worth guarding with her life. "I told you to leave," she said firmly, her voice betraying her worry. "It's not safe for you. Not with me." Jake frowned, not understanding. "I don't get it. What's going on, Lyra? What are you really hiding? You're not from around here, I know that much. And I know you're scared, but I can help." Lyra's expression softened for a brief moment, but it quickly turned back to one of caution. "You can't help," she said, her tone almost regretful. "This is bigger than both of us." Jake studied her face, trying to read the emotions hidden behind her words. She seemed so different, so otherworldly, And yet there was a humanity about her that he couldn't ignore. She was scared. There was no doubt about that. But why? Why was an alien girl so terrified on Earth? And why did she trust him, even just a little? "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice gentle. "But I want to. I want to help you, Lyra. You're not alone here." Lyra shook her head, looking down at the ground. For a moment, she appeared lost in thought. "I don't have a choice," she muttered. "I'm running from something. Someone. They'll come for me. They'll come for the keycard." "Keycard," Jake repeated, confused. "What's that? Is that what you've been holding on to? That device?" Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. "It's not just any device. It's a keycard. A map. A guide to something powerful. Something that can change everything." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had thought that maybe he was getting in over his head, but now the situation felt even more serious. A keycard. A map. What could be so important that it would cause an alien to run for her life? But why would someone want it? Jake asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "The keycard is part of something much older," Lyra explained, her voice quieter now, as if she was telling him a secret. "It's not just a map. It's the key to unlocking an ancient weapon, a weapon so powerful that it could destroy entire planets. My people have guarded it for centuries, making sure it never falls into the wrong hands. But somehow, someone found out about it." Jake stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. A weapon. A weapon that could destroy planets. That was hard to believe, but the fear in Lyra's eyes made it impossible to doubt her. She wasn't making this up. Whatever she had just revealed, it was real. And it was dangerous. "So, someone's after you because of this weapon?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. Lyra nodded again, her face grim. "Yes, and they will stop at nothing to get it. I can't let them have it, Jake. If they do, everything will be lost." Jake's mind raced. He didn't know what to do or how to help. He was just a regular guy, a human living in a city full of strangers and mysteries. But for some reason, this alien girl had trusted him enough to share her secret and ask for his help. And now he couldn't turn his back on her. He had to figure out what was really going on, what he could do to protect her. "We can't stay here," Lyra said urgently, her voice shaking slightly. "We need to move, Jake. If they find us, if they find the keycard, I'll never be able to stop them." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where do we go? What do we do?" Lyra looked around, her eyes scanning the street once again. "Follow me," she said, taking a deep breath. "There's a place, an old safe house, where we can hide for now. We have to get there before they find us." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked quickly down the alley, her steps measured and deliberate. Jake hesitated for only a moment before following her. His mind was still racing with questions, but for now, he had no choice but to trust her. She was his guide now, and he had no idea what dangers lay ahead. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The adventure, the danger, the mystery, it was all just starting. And Jake had a feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The keycard revelation. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something huge was unfolding around him. Lyra, the alien girl he had just met, was more than just an outcast from another world. She was running from something, someone, and the device she carried, the keycard, was at the heart of it all. The weight of what she had revealed earlier echoed in his mind. The keycard wasn't just a map. It was a weapon, a key to something ancient, powerful, and dangerous. And now, whoever was hunting her wanted it. As they made their way through the narrow streets, Lyra remained tense, her pace quick and purposeful. Jake could barely keep up, but he tried not to ask too many questions. He didn't want to slow her down. She seemed to know where she was going, and as much as he wanted to understand everything, he had a feeling that Lyra was only telling him pieces of the truth. They turned a corner, and Jake noticed a building ahead that looked unlike any other in the city. It was old, much older than the high-tech structures surrounding it. The walls were cracked, and the windows were covered with a layer of dust and grime. It looked abandoned. Lyra stopped in front of the door and looked around cautiously. "This is it," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Stay close." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He was already on edge, his mind spinning with the thought of what was happening. He followed her into the building, and as the door creaked open, a chill ran down his spine. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost suffocating. The dim light that filtered through the cracked windows revealed old furniture covered in sheets and shelves filled with forgotten items. The place seemed frozen in time, like a relic of the past. Lyra led him to a small room in the back of the building. There she set down her bag and pulled out the device. The keycard. Carefully, her hands trembled slightly as she held it, and for the first time, Jake saw the fear that had been hiding behind her brave facade. "This is it," she said, her voice tight. "This keycard is the only thing that can unlock the location of the weapon. But it's not just a map. It's also a lock that only certain people can open." Jake leaned in, his curiosity piqued. He could see the intricate design on the keycard now, strange symbols that shifted and pulsed in the dim light. They weren't just markings. They were alive, changing as if they had a purpose of their own. The device seemed to hum with power, and Jake could feel it in the air, a kind of energy that was both terrifying and magnetic. "But why don't you just use it to unlock the weapon?" Jake asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might break the tension in the room. Lyra shook her head. "It's not that simple. Only a few of us know how to use it. My people, the ones who created this device, have been guarding it for centuries. Only the chosen ones, those with the right blood, can activate the keycard. And even then, there's a risk." "A risk?" Jake echoed, his heart racing. "What kind of risk?" Lyra's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she seemed to look far away, as if she was lost in a memory. "The weapon is not just a tool. It's a force that, if misused, could wipe out entire civilizations. The keycard is meant to prevent that. It's supposed to keep the weapon sealed, hidden away, until the right person comes along to use it for good." Jake didn't know what to say. The gravity of her words was sinking in, and he began to understand why Lyra was so terrified. Whoever was after the keycard didn't care about the consequences. They wanted the power it held, and they would do anything to get it. "Do you know who's after you?" Jake asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard. But his mind was racing with possibilities. Who could be so dangerous that they would hunt down an alien girl and a mysterious keycard? Lyra hesitated before answering. "Yes, they're called the Oracles. They're a group of beings, part alien, part machine, who believe they can control the weapon. They think they're the only ones worthy of wielding its power, and they'll stop at nothing to take it from me." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The Oracles sounded like something out of a nightmare, a group of beings who saw themselves as gods, capable of destroying anything that stood in their way. And now, they were after Lyra and the keycard. "But why don't you just leave?" Jake asked. "Why not leave Earth and take the keycard somewhere safe?" Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "I can't just leave. The keycard's energy is tied to this planet. If I were to leave, it could cause the weapon to activate on its own. The Oracles would have what they want, and no one would be able to stop them. Earth is the only place where the keycard can stay hidden, locked away, until the time comes." Jake stared at her, trying to comprehend everything she had just said. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. A weapon that could destroy civilizations, a keycard that could unlock it, and now, a group of ruthless, powerful beings were hunting them down. "How do you know all this?" Jake asked. "How do you know so much about the weapon and the Oracles?" Lyra's expression softened, because I was trained to guard it. My people, the ones who created the Keycard, chose me to protect it. I spent my whole life learning about it, studying its history, but I never expected it to be this dangerous. I never imagined someone would actually try to steal it. Jake was quiet for a moment, trying to process everything. It was like something out of a science fiction movie, a movie that was now his reality. An alien girl, a Keycard that could destroy the universe, and a group of powerful beings who were after it all. It felt like he had stepped into a story much bigger than his own life. "Is there any way we can stop the oracles?" Jake asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. It felt ridiculous, even to him. What could he, a regular human, possibly do to fight beings like the oracles? Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know," she said softly. "But together, maybe we can figure it out. If we're going to protect the Keycard, we'll need to work together. And we'll need to be careful. The oracles won't stop. They'll keep coming for it, no matter where we go." Jake nodded slowly. He didn't know what he was getting into. But one thing was clear. He was in this now, whether he liked it or not. And no matter how dangerous it got, he couldn't turn back. The stakes had just gotten higher, and Jake knew that the adventure, if you could even call it that, was only beginning. The pursuers strike. The night stretched on, and Jake and Lyra remained hidden in the forgotten sanctuary. The weight of the revelations from earlier hung heavy in the air. The oracles were relentless, and the danger was no longer a distant threat. It was real, and it was closing in fast. Lyra had tried to explain how much was at stake, but now, the reality of the situation was finally starting to hit Jake. A weapon capable of wiping out civilizations, a mysterious Keycard, and the oracles, who would stop at nothing to seize it. Jake was no longer just a curious bystander. He was now part of something that he couldn't fully understand, something far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And yet, despite the gravity of the situation, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that he had a role to play in this. He had to protect Lyra. He had to protect the Keycard. But as they sat in the quiet, dust-filled room, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. At first, Jake thought it was just the wind, but then the unmistakable sound of heavy boots echoed through the narrow hallways, growing louder with each passing second. Lyra stiffened, her eyes going wide with fear. "They found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard of raids, of dangerous people searching for rare artifacts, but nothing had prepared him for this. He could feel the weight of the situation closing in, like the walls of the old building were shrinking around him. The oracles had arrived. Lyra grabbed his arm, pulling him up from the dusty floor. "We need to leave now. They won't stop until they have the Keycard. I won't let them get it. Not now. Not ever." Jake didn't need any more convincing. He followed her, his mind racing as they moved through the darkened corridors. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the old building seemed amplified, as if the world was holding its breath. Lyra moved swiftly, her steps confident, though her eyes were filled with an unspoken dread. Jake could tell that this wasn't the first time she had run from danger, but that didn't make it any easier. They reached the back exit, but as Lyra pushed open the door, a harsh voice called out from the shadows. "Where do you think you're going, Lyra?" Jake froze, his body tensing. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, his silhouette tall and imposing. The man wore dark armor, and his face was obscured by a sleek helmet, though Jake could see the glowing red eyes peering out from behind it. It was one of them, the oracles. Lyra's grip on Jake's arm tightened. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Leave, now, before it's too late." The oracle stepped forward, his voice cold and unyielding. "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation, Lyra. The Keycard doesn't belong to you. It never did. It belongs to us, and you will give it to us. Now." Jake felt his stomach twist. The oracle's words were laced with authority, as if he believed his claim was absolute. But there was something about the way he spoke, something cold and calculating, that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. This wasn't just a simple thief after a valuable object. This was something far more dangerous. "We'll never give it to you," Lyra said fiercely, her eyes flashing with defiance. "Not now. Not ever." The oracle's gaze flickered toward Jake, and for the first time, Jake felt the full weight of the situation. This was no longer just about Lyra and the keycard. The oracles were after him too, and they were ruthless. "I suggest you reconsider, human," the oracle said, his voice laced with menace. "You're standing in the way of something much bigger than yourself. But if you're smart, you'll walk away." Now, Jake knew he had no choice. He couldn't let Lyra face this alone. He glanced at her, and she gave him a slight nod, as if telling him to trust his instincts. Without another word, Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metallic device, a tool he had taken from the building's debris earlier, not knowing what it was for. He held it up, trying to give the appearance of confidence, though his heart was pounding. The oracle's eyes narrowed as he saw Jake's movement. "You think that will stop me?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, he pushed a button on the device, and a low hum filled the air. For a brief moment, the oracle faltered, his focus momentarily breaking. It was just enough of a distraction. Lyra lunged forward, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him toward the open door. The oracle shouted something, an order to his companions, but Jake barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. They ran. The streets outside were darker than usual, the city lights casting long shadows as they sprinted down the alleyway. Lyra pulled Jake with a strength he hadn't realized she possessed, moving quickly and decisively. They had no time to waste. The oracle's men would be on them in seconds, and they couldn't afford to be caught. They reached the end of the alley, and Lyra veered left, pulling Jake into a narrow side street that led deeper into the city. Jake could hear footsteps behind them, but he didn't dare look back. Every instinct told him to keep running, to keep going until they were out of sight. "This way," Lyra hissed, pulling him through a small hidden door on the side of an old warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and machinery. The place was abandoned, the remnants of forgotten tools and equipment scattered across the floor. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it would have to do. For now. Lyra turned to Jake, her eyes wide with urgency. "We can't stay here long. The oracles will be close behind. We need to get to the safe house. It's the only place where we can hide." Jake nodded, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind was racing. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing. They couldn't stop. Not now. "Lead the way," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Lyra glanced at the door, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and began to move deeper into the shadows of the warehouse, Jake close behind her. The chase had just begun, and the danger was only getting worse. They had to survive, or the galaxy, everything they knew, would be lost. The hidden sanctuary. The chase had been relentless. For what felt like hours, Jake and Lyra had moved through the maze of Vespera's hidden streets, dodging the oracle's pursuit. Each corner they turned, each shadow they hid in, only seemed to provide temporary safety. But as they moved deeper into the underbelly of the city, a strange sense of familiarity returned to Lyra. She was no longer running blindly. She was leading Jake to a place she had once known well, a place that, in her mind, was still a sanctuary. The safe house wasn't much, an unremarkable building tucked away in a forgotten part of the city, but it had once been a refuge for those in need, a sanctuary for those who wanted to hide from the world. Lyra's people had established it long ago, and despite its abandonment, it still held the secrets she needed. The walls, covered with old runes and faded symbols, seemed to hum with the remnants of a long-lost power, a power Lyra had never fully understood, but that she had been trained to protect. They arrived at the entrance, a small weathered door tucked between two crumbling buildings. Lyra pressed her hand to the doorframe, whispering a phrase in an ancient tongue, and with a soft click, the door creaked open. It was as if the building had been waiting for her all this time, the centuries of disuse vanishing in an instant. Inside, the air was cool and still. The faint smell of dust and old books hung in the air, but there was a quiet sense of safety here. For the first time in hours, Jake felt the tension in his chest ease, though he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The oracles were still up there, still hunting them. Lyra stepped inside first, her eyes scanning the room as if she were reacquainting herself with an old friend. She took a deep breath and led Jake through a narrow hallway, the walls lined with shelves of forgotten artifacts and worn maps. In the back of the building, a small chamber awaited, dimly lit by a series of glowing stones embedded in the walls. This was where the keycard would be safe, at least for now. Jake followed Lyra into the chamber, his eyes drawn to the strange artifacts around them. He had never seen anything like it. Some of the objects were clearly from Earth, but others were completely alien, their designs intricate and unfamiliar. They looked like relics from another time, another universe, even. And yet, Lyra moved with ease, as if she belonged here, as if this place had always been her home. Lyra placed the keycard on a pedestal in the center of the room, the glowing symbols on the device casting an eerie light across her face. She looked at it with a mixture of reverence and fear, as if it held the answers to questions she had never dared to ask. "Here," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken history. "This is where it all began. This is where the keycard was first hidden, where the power of the weapon was locked away." Jake stepped closer, but he didn't touch the keycard. Something about it made him feel uneasy, as if the device was alive, watching them, waiting for something. "Why here?" Jake asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something. Lyra turned to him, her eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "Because this is where my people believed the weapon's power could be contained. The oracles never found this place. They don't know about it. Not yet." Jake's eyes narrowed. "But you said they were after the keycard. How long do we have before they find us?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze drifting to the shadows in the room, as though she could see the oracles already closing in. "Not long. They'd been searching for this safe house for years. They know it exists. They just didn't know how to find it. But now that they've seen the keycard, they'll stop at nothing to get it." Jake felt a chill run through him. "What happens if they get it?" Lyra looked down at the keycard, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted it on the pedestal. "If they unlock the weapon, they could destroy everything. The weapon is more than just a tool of war. It's a force that can reshape entire civilizations. The oracles believe they can control it, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. No one does. Not even my people fully understood the power that's locked inside that card." Jake could feel the weight of her words, the desperation in her voice. He knew they couldn't just hide here forever. The oracles would come. They always did. "So what now?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "What's our next move?" Lyra turned back to him, her expression hardening with resolve. "We can't just wait for them to come to us. We need to find a way to stop them, to stop the weapon from falling into their hands. There's a way to lock it away for good, but I need your help." Jake didn't hesitate. He could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him, but he knew what he had to do. "What do you need me to do?" Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of hope in them. "I need you to trust me, Jake. You've seen the danger we're facing. You've seen the oracles. They're relentless, but you also saw what the keycard can do. It's the only way we can stop them." She stepped closer to the pedestal, her fingers brushing against the device, as though reassuring herself that it was still there, still safe. "There's a place," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. a hidden vault, deep beneath the surface of this planet. Only a select few know how to access it, but I've been trained for this. We need to take the keycard there, lock it away where no one can find it. If we do this, we can stop the oracles from using the weapon. We can finally end this. Jake's mind was racing. He had no idea how they would reach this hidden vault, or how they would escape the oracles long enough to do it. But one thing was certain. He couldn't let Lyra face this alone. The weapon, the keycard, the oracles, it was all too much for him to process. But it didn't matter. Lyra had trusted him with her secret, and now he had to do whatever it took to protect her, to protect the keycard, and to stop the oracles from unleashing the weapon. "Let's do it," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "Where do we start?" Lyra nodded, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "We leave immediately. The oracles are close, and we can't afford to waste any more time." As she gathered the keycard, preparing to leave the sanctuary, Jake couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The city outside was dangerous, and the oracles were closing in. But this was their only chance. They had to make it count. Together, they would face whatever came next. They had no choice. And so, with the keycard safely in hand, they set off into the unknown, knowing that the fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. The journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. Betrayal and revelation. The dim light of the city flickered around them as Lyra and Jake ventured further into the unknown. With each step, the gravity of their mission weighed heavier on Jake's shoulders. The fate of the galaxy, or at least the fate of Earth, was now tied to the keycard that Lyra carried. It wasn't just an object. It was a key to unimaginable power. And that power was the reason they couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop running. The oracles were closing in, and every shadow seemed like it could hide an enemy waiting to strike. As they navigated the winding alleyways, Lyra's expression remained focused, her steps steady despite the growing tension. The journey ahead was perilous. There were no guarantees that the hidden vault Lyra spoke of would be able to stop the oracles, or that they would even make it there in one piece. But it was their only chance, and if they failed, the weapon inside the keycard would fall into the hands of the oracles, and the consequences would be catastrophic. "We're getting closer," Lyra said, her voice low, almost as if speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. She was leading them toward an abandoned sector of the city, one that few people dared to enter. The path was treacherous, and the buildings here were in a state of ruin, covered in layers of grime and neglect. Yet, this was where the keycard could be secured. Jake glanced around, uneasy. "How do you know this place so well? I mean, this seems like a ghost town." Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her eyes darted to the street ahead, and she motioned for Jake to keep his voice down. "My people built places like this, hidden safe houses, old sanctuaries, even vaults, long before the oracles ever came to power. But this part of the city," she paused, her voice turning darker, "this is where things went wrong. It's where the oracles first learned about the keycard. The history of this place is tangled up in lies, betrayal, and secrets." Jake's mind raced with questions, but Lyra's tone discouraged him from asking more. The answer was clear enough. This was a place of great significance, a place of lost history. And if the oracles were after the keycard, this was likely where they would be heading next. They moved forward cautiously, ducking into shadowed alcoves whenever they heard the distant hum of engines or the click of boots on the street. The air was thick with tension, and Jake couldn't help but notice the subtle but ever-present feeling that something was wrong. Lyra's movements, usually fluid and confident, were now marked by a quiet urgency. As they rounded a corner, Lyra suddenly stopped. Her hand shot out, gripping Jake's arm, pulling him to a halt. Her face was pale, and for the first time, Jake saw a look of raw fear in her eyes. "What is it?" Jake whispered, trying to peer around her to see what had caused her to stop. Lyra's voice was barely audible. "They're here. The oracles. They're not far. I can feel them. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They were so close to their destination, so close to the vault that could protect them. But now, they were trapped. There was no way to outrun them. He took a deep breath. We can't stop now. We have to keep moving. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the streets. You're right, she said, though her voice was filled with doubt. But we can't let them know where we're going. If they catch us before we reach the vault. She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake didn't need her to. He understood. If they didn't make it, the oracles would have the keycard, and the galaxy would be at their mercy. They continued down the alley, their footsteps quickening as the sound of distant voices grew louder. Then suddenly, a voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Stop right there, Lyra. Jake froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was one of the oracles. But this wasn't just any oracle. This was a face Jake recognized, a face he never thought he'd see again. Out of the shadows stepped a figure, tall and imposing, clad in dark armor. His helmet was sleek and polished, but the moment he spoke again, Jake felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. I never thought I'd find you here, Lyra, the figure said, his voice tinged with bitterness. But of course, you would lead me straight to it, to the keycard. Lyra's body tensed. Her hand instinctively moved to the device at her waist, but Jake knew there was no way to fight their way out of this. Not with the oracles closing in. The figure lifted his helmet, revealing a familiar face, one Jake had never expected to see again. It was Eric, a former ally, a former friend. Or at least, that's who he had been before everything changed. Eric. Jake's voice trembled with disbelief. What are you doing here? Eric's lips curled into a cold smile. I've been waiting for this moment, Jake. All these years. You think I forgot. You think I forgot the way you abandoned me. His gaze shifted to Lyra, his eyes narrowing. And you, Lyra. I should have known it was you who had the keycard all along. You were always the one with the answers, weren't you? Jake felt his stomach drop. The betrayal, the sting of Eric's words, hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't seen Eric in years, ever since their last mission together, when Eric had disappeared without a trace. Jake had assumed he was dead or lost, but to find him standing here, aligned with the very enemies they were fighting against, it was a shock that cut deep. I didn't abandon you, Eric, Jake said, his voice hard with emotion. But Eric held up a hand, cutting him off. Don't pretend like you're the hero in this story, Jake. You were weak. You failed us both. And now I found my true path. The oracles are the future. And you're just a roadblock. The look in Eric's eyes was chilling. He wasn't the friend Jake had known. He was something else, something darker, something driven by an agenda far more dangerous than Jake had ever imagined. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. You don't have to do this, Eric. You don't have to follow them. You can still turn back. Eric's eyes flashed with anger. I made my choice long ago. I'm no longer the man you knew, Lyra. The oracles have given me power. Power I could only dream of before. Jake's mind raced. The oracles had twisted Eric into something unrecognizable. And now he was their tool, the enemy they had to defeat. But Jake couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. Eric had been his closest ally, and now he was standing in their way. So, what happens now? Jake asked, his voice bitter. You take the keycard and destroy everything we've been fighting for. Eric smiled again, a cruel and empty smile. No, not destroy. Control. I'm not interested in destruction, Jake. I'm interested in power. And soon, the keycard will be mine. A dangerous silence stretched between them, each of them knowing that the next moments would decide everything. Betrayal had already been planted. Now, all that was left was for the final choice to be made. Would Jake and Lyra survive this? Could they stop the weapon from falling into the wrong hands? Jake's hand instinctively reached for the device at his waist. The battle for the keycard had begun, and there would be no turning back. The final confrontation and escape. The silence that followed Eric's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity, and the weight of the moment pressed down on Jake and Lyra with a crushing intensity. Eric's betrayal wasn't just a personal blow. It was a devastating turn in the larger war they were fighting. They had trusted him. He had been their ally, their friend. But now, standing before them as an agent of the Oracles, it was clear that everything had changed. Eric's eyes flickered between Jake and Lyra, his lips curling into a grin that felt more like a sneer. The confidence in his stance betrayed a man who had fully embraced his new allegiance. It was as though he had always been waiting for this moment, waiting for the moment when he would wield the power of the keycard, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a symbol of control, a tool to reshape the galaxy as he saw fit. "You still don't get it, do you?" Eric said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "The power inside that keycard, it's not just a weapon. It's a tool to rewrite everything. The Oracles know what they're doing. They're the only ones who have the vision, the strength to rule the galaxy. You were always too weak to understand that, Jake." Jake clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. The words cut deep, but he knew he couldn't let them cloud his judgment. This wasn't about him. This was about stopping Eric, stopping the Oracles, and making sure the keycard never fell into their hands. "I'm not weak, Eric," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. "And I'm not letting you destroy everything we'd fought for." Eric's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "You're just a human. You've always been just a human." Lyra stepped forward, her expression fierce. "And you've always been just a pawn, Eric. A pawn who has no idea what he's truly dealing with." For a moment, it seemed like Eric might retaliate with anger, but instead, he only chuckled softly to himself. The sound was hollow, as if he had already made peace with the path he had chosen, no matter the cost. "You'll learn," Eric said, his tone darkening, "that the universe doesn't care about your morality. Power is the only thing that matters." Jake could feel the tension crackling in the air. He knew they couldn't keep standing here, locked in a standoff. The Oracles would be coming soon, and Eric wasn't alone. He could feel their presence, feel the pull of the hunt closing in. If they didn't act now, the keycard would be lost forever. Without warning, Lyra moved. She darted to the side, pulling Jake along with her as she sprinted for the narrow alley that led toward the deeper underground passages. It was the only way out. It was the only chance they had. "Get the keycard and go," Lyra shouted as she shoved Jake forward, her voice filled with urgency. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "I'll hold him off." Jake turned back, ready to argue, but Lyra's eyes were set with a purpose he couldn't ignore. She was willing to fight. She was willing to sacrifice herself to give him a chance to escape. He wasn't about to let her do that alone. But before he could take a single step, Eric's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Don't think you can outrun me, Lyra. The Oracles don't lose." Eric's figure blurred as he moved with unnatural speed, his armor glinting in the dim light. He was fast, too fast. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his heart wouldn't allow him to leave Lyra behind. He had to help her. "Lyra," Jake shouted, reaching for her, but in that split second, Eric closed the gap between them. The confrontation was about to turn into something much worse, something more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Before Jake could even react, the air around them seemed to crackle, and a sharp metallic sound rang out. Lyra had activated the keycard, its symbols glowing brightly in the darkness. Eric stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You!" Eric's voice faltered as the keycard's light grew brighter, a pulsing energy filling the air, vibrating with power. "This is the real power, Eric," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the threat before them. "This keycard doesn't just unlock the weapon. It's also the key to stopping people like you. The oracles won't control it. Not if I have anything to say about it." Eric's face twisted in rage, but there was a moment of hesitation in his gaze. He had underestimated Lyra, underestimated the true power of the keycard. But that hesitation was fleeting, and Jake could see the determination in Eric's eyes. The final battle was at hand. "Enough games," Eric roared, drawing a sleek weapon from his side, a dark, menacing blade that shimmered with energy. He lunged forward, the blade crackling with an otherworldly hum. Without thinking, Jake lunged to intercept, grabbing Eric's arm just as the blade swung toward Lyra. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through Jake's body, but he held on, pushing Eric back. He wasn't strong enough, not compared to Eric's enhanced strength, but he didn't let go. "Not now. You want to destroy everything we've built," Jake shouted, struggling to keep his grip on Eric. "You're not the one who gets to decide that." Lyra, her face pale but resolute, raised the keycard once more, directing the light toward Eric. The energy surged, enveloping the room in a blinding glow. For a moment, time seemed to slow, the intensity of the moment hanging in the balance. Then, with a burst of light, the keycard emitted a shockwave that knocked both Jake and Eric back. The force of it sent Eric sprawling to the ground, his weapon falling from his grip. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the soft hum of the keycard's energy. Lyra gasped, her body trembling with exhaustion. The power of the keycard had taken its toll, but the truth was clear. Eric had been stopped, and the oracles would be denied their weapon. "We have to go. Now," Jake shouted, pulling Lyra to her feet. He didn't wait for a response. He couldn't afford to. The oracles were still out there, and they were coming. If they stayed here, they wouldn't make it out alive. Together, they bolted down the alley, racing toward the hidden vault. They didn't look back, not even once. They knew they were running out of time. And the only thing that mattered now was escaping and ensuring that the keycard would never fall into the wrong hands. As the vault doors began to open, the sounds of approaching footsteps grew louder, but Lyra and Jake knew they were one step closer to victory. With one last glance toward the world they were leaving behind, they stepped into the vault, closing the door behind them. The galaxy would never be the same, but for now, at least, it was safe.